You are standing in your kitchen right now, and somewhere behind you that refrigerator is running. You can hear it, that low hum that never stops, not during the day, not at 2 in the morning, not on a Sunday. It just runs. And every time it cycles on, your electric meter ticks a little further in the wrong direction. The average American household spends between $150 and $200 a year just to power that one appliance. That is before you factor in the repair calls, and there will be repair calls, because the average refrigerator breaks down at least once every 8 to 12 years. When it does, you are looking at $200 to $400 for a service visit, sometimes more depending on what failed. And when the compressor goes, which it always eventually does, you are either spending $600 to $1,000 on a repair, or you are buying a new unit. A decent refrigerator today costs between $800 and $2,500, depending on the brand and the features, and in about 10 years you will be doing it all over again. That is before we even get to the real problem, the one most people do not think about until it is too late. When the power goes out, everything in that refrigerator has about 4 hours before it starts to go bad. Everything in the freezer has about 48 hours, maybe a little more if you keep the door shut. A summer storm, a grid failure, a downed line 2 streets over, and everything your family was counting on for the next week is now a question mark. The meat, the dairy, the vegetables someone spent a Saturday afternoon putting up, all of it sitting there in the dark, getting warmer by the hour. Now I want to tell you about something I found about 3 years ago buried in an agricultural extension bulletin published by Penn State University. A technique so old that it was used in the Nile River Valley around 2500 BC. Confirmed by modern researchers, practiced without interruption by farming communities in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania for over 200 years, and still working today just as reliably as it ever did. It requires no electricity, it requires no compressor, no refrigerant, no moving parts of any kind. The entire setup costs about $3 at your local hardware store, and once it is in the ground, it will keep working whether the grid is up or not, whether the power company raises your rates or not, and whether or not that compressor in your kitchen decides today is the day it finally gives out. I am going to show you exactly how it works and exactly how to build one. But first I need to explain something about the ground underneath your feet, because once you understand what is actually happening down there, this whole thing will make complete sense. Cut to a slow pan of a quiet rural yard, north side of a house, late afternoon light. About 4 feet below the surface of the earth, something remarkable happens. The temperature stabilizes. It stops responding to the weather above. It does not care that it is 104 degrees in August or 12 degrees below zero in February. At 4 feet down, the soil in most of the continental United States holds a temperature that stays between 50 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. In the northern states, it sits closer to 45. In the deep south, it runs a few degrees warmer. But in either case, it barely moves. Maybe 3 or 4 degrees of variation across an entire calendar year. This is not folklore. It is basic earth science. The technical term is geothermal thermal mass, and it works because the enormous volume of soil and rock below the surface absorbs and releases heat so slowly that the daily and seasonal swings happening on the surface never have time to penetrate very deep. The sun hammers the ground all summer, and that heat does eventually work its way down, but by the time it reaches 4 feet, it has lost almost all of its strength. The same thing happens in winter. The cold bites at the surface, but 4 feet down, the earth has not even noticed yet. The people who figured this out first were not scientists. They were farmers. They were people whose survival depended on keeping food edible through a Pennsylvania winter or an Ohio summer without any of the technology we take for granted today. And they figured it out not by running experiments in a laboratory, but by paying attention to the world around them for generation after generation. The Amish communities in Holmes County, Ohio, and Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, have been using underground cold storage continuously since the early 1800s. Some of these family farms have root cellars that have been in continuous use for over 150 years. The basic principle has never changed because it has never needed to. You go deep enough, you stay cool, your food survives. The most basic version of this system is almost embarrassingly simple. You need a standard 5-gallon plastic bucket, the kind you find at any hardware store for $2 to $3. You need a shovel. And you need a shady spot in your yard, preferably the north side of your house, or a building, because that side gets the least direct sunlight across all 4 seasons. That matters more than most people think. Even a few degrees of shade at the surface makes a measurable difference to the temperature down below. You dig a hole. The hole needs to be deep enough so that when you set the bucket inside it, the rim of the bucket sits approximately level with the surface of the ground. For a standard 5-gallon bucket, that means you are digging roughly 14 to 16 inches down. This is not a major excavation. It is about 20 minutes of work with a regular garden spade. Set the bucket in the hole. Pack the dirt tight around the outside, making sure there are no air gaps between the bucket wall and the soil. Air gaps are insulators. You want solid earth contact all the way around because that contact is what transfers the stable underground temperature directly into the bucket. Snap a lid on top to keep rain and insects out, and if you want to add a little extra insulation against hard frost, lay a few inches of straw or dry leaves on top of the lid. That is the whole system. Total cost, $3 and a piece of your Saturday morning. Inside that bucket, you can store root vegetables like carrots, beets, potatoes, turnips, and parsnips for weeks, sometimes for months. The key is in how you pack them. You never let two pieces of produce touch each other directly. Between each layer of vegetables, you put a layer of damp sand or clean sawdust. Not soaking wet, just lightly moist, the way a wrung-out sponge feels. That moisture control is what keeps the vegetables from shriveling, because in a root cellar, the humidity is just as important as the temperature. Penn State Extension has published research on this specifically. Their studies found that the most effective root cellars maintain temperatures between 32 and 40 degrees Fahrenheit, with relative humidity between 85 and 95%. The buried bucket gets you close to both of those numbers naturally, without any equipment designed to achieve them. The earth provides the cold, the damp packing material provides the humidity, and the produce sits in a kind of suspended state, alive but dormant, not growing, not rotting, just waiting. Close-up of hands layering carrots in sand inside a 5-gallon bucket, I want to tell you about an Amish farmer named Eli Stoltzfus, who farms about 80 acres outside of Intercourse, Pennsylvania in Lancaster County. I met him 3 years ago when I was driving through the area doing research on traditional farming practices. His family has worked the same land since 1887, and he knows more about keeping food alive without electricity than anyone I've met in 20 years of looking into this kind of thing. He walked me around the north side of his barn and showed me a row of metal garbage cans, the old galvanized steel kind buried in a line along the foundation. Each one had a hinged lid sitting almost flush with the ground. He said there were 7 of them altogether, each one holding a different category of produce. Potatoes in one, carrots and beets in another. Apples stored separately because apples give off ethylene gas, and he said that gas will ruin everything else if you let them share a container. He has been rotating that same storage system through every winter since he took over the farm from his father in 1974. He told me those cans had been in the ground since his grandfather put them there in the late 1940s, and that in all that time, he had never lost a meaningful amount of food to spoilage from temperature failure. I asked him what he thought of modern refrigerators. He looked at me for a second, and then he said, "We are not against cold. We are against paying someone else to make it when the earth already does it for free." That is not a quote I have forgotten. The bigger version of this system, using metal garbage cans instead of plastic buckets, works on exactly the same principle, but gives you dramatically more storage capacity. A standard 32-gallon galvanized steel can, buried with its rim, at ground level, will hold enough produce to feed a family of 4 through a significant portion of a winter. You can bury several of them in a row, label each one with a stake or a painted marker, and run a system that keeps different categories of food separated the way a proper root cellar would. The galvanized steel matters for long-term installations. Plastic buckets are fine for a season or 2, but they can become brittle in repeated freeze-thaw cycles over many years. Steel is more durable in the ground, and it also conducts the Earth's temperature slightly more efficiently because metal transfers heat faster than plastic. Either one works, the steel lasts longer. Now, I want to talk about the history behind this because this is not just an Amish tradition. This is not regional folk practice. This goes back much further than any Amish settlement in America, and when you understand where it actually comes from, the fact that we have largely abandoned it starts to look like a strange and expensive choice. The ancient Egyptians were using underground cold storage around 2500 BC. Archaeologists excavating sites along the Nile have found evidence of pit storage structures lined with straw and clay that were specifically designed to maintain cool temperatures for storing grain, fruit, and some preserved meats. The dry Egyptian climate made evaporative cooling possible even at the surface, but in the deeper storage pits it was the same geothermal principle at work. Go deep enough and the earth holds a steady temperature. The Egyptians knew this because they tested it by observing what survived and what did not, across thousands of harvests. The Romans built extensive underground storage systems called celi. Roman agricultural writers, including Marcus Terentius Varro, who wrote a 3-volume agricultural manual called Rerum Rusticarum around 37 BC, described specific construction methods for underground food cellars, including recommended depths for different climates and materials for lining the walls to maintain humidity. Varro wrote, and I am paraphrasing from the Latin here, that the earth at depth is a better keeper of things than the most carefully built surface structure, because the earth does not change, and men and their buildings always do. The technique moved through medieval Europe with no modifications of any significance because there were no modifications needed. Every farmstead in England, France, and Germany had a root cellar or a buried storage pit. The Pilgrims who landed at Plymouth in 1620 dug their first food storage pits within weeks of arriving before they had built permanent shelters, because they understood that keeping their food cold was more urgent than keeping themselves warm. Their survival journals document this. You can read those accounts in the collections at the Plymouth Antiquarian Society. When European settlers moved into Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Virginia in the late 1700s, they brought this knowledge with them as a matter of routine. It was not a secret. It was not special, it was just what you did if you wanted food to last through a winter. The refrigerator did not make this knowledge obsolete, it just made it easier for manufacturers to sell us something that performed the same function at a significant ongoing cost. Old photograph of a 19th century root cellar door set into a hillside. The modern refrigerator was introduced to the mass consumer market in the United States in the 1920s. General Electric released the monitor top refrigerator in 1927, the first widely available electric household refrigerator, priced at $520, which is equivalent to roughly $9,000 in today's dollars. It was a luxury product marketed specifically as a replacement for the icebox, which was itself a replacement for the root cellar. The marketing campaign for the monitor top did not mention root cellars at all. It compared itself to the icebox and made the icebox look old-fashioned. The root cellar, which had been feeding American families reliably for 300 years, was quietly written out of the conversation. By the 1950s, as refrigerators became standard equipment in new American homes, the root cellar had gone from a farmstead necessity to an oddity, something old people had, something associated with poverty or with communities seen as backward. The appliance industry did not need to actively campaign against root cellars. They just needed to make their product feel modern and let the cultural association between electricity and progress do the rest of the work. I am not here to tell you that you should throw away your refrigerator. I have a refrigerator. I use it every day for the things it does well: dairy, meat, leftovers, beverages. But there is a category of food, root vegetables, and certain fruits that the refrigerator actually does not handle particularly well, and that the underground system handles better. Here is something most people do not know. The crisper drawer in your refrigerator runs at a humidity level of roughly 50 to 60%, even when it is set to the high humidity setting. For root vegetables, the optimal humidity is between 85 and 95%. That gap explains why carrots go limp and potatoes go soft in the fridge within a week or two, while those same vegetables stored in damp sand at 50 degrees underground will stay firm and fresh for 2 to 3 months. The refrigerator is not the right tool for that job, and the underground system handles it at a cost of approximately nothing. Let me walk you through the expanded version of this setup, the one that gives you enough capacity to make a meaningful difference to your household food budget and your food security. Because the 5-gallon bucket is a great starting point, but if you want to store a serious quantity of food, you need to scale up slightly. For a family of 4, I recommend starting with 3 buried containers. 2 32-gallon galvanized steel garbage cans and 1 5-gallon plastic bucket. Bury the garbage cans along the north wall of your house or garage, spaced about 2 feet apart. Dig each hole so the rim sits at ground level. Pack the dirt firmly against the outside walls. For the lids, use the original lids the cans came with, but add a simple weatherproofing step. Run a bead of silicone cork around the inside of the lid rim to create a seal. This keeps rain and insects out without trapping moisture inside. Use the 5-gallon bucket separately, at least 10 feet from the garbage cans, for apple storage. Apples stored underground stay crisp and fresh for 3 to 4 months in the right conditions, but apples produce ethylene gas as they age, and that gas accelerates ripening and eventual spoilage in every other vegetable it touches. Keeping them isolated is the single most important rule in traditional root cellar management, and it is the rule most people break when they first try this, and then blame the system for the results. In the first garbage can, store your potatoes. Layer them in dry straw or paper, not sand, because potatoes need lower humidity than most other root vegetables. About 85 to 90% is ideal for potatoes, whereas carrots and beets prefer closer to 95. Dry straw or shredded newspaper achieves that slightly lower moisture level. In the second garbage can, store your carrots, beets, turnips, and parsnips layered in damp sand. Check the sand every 3 to 4 weeks during storage and re-dampen it lightly if it has dried out. You are looking for the texture of a sandcastle that holds its shape, damp but not dripping. Arrange produce so the items you will use first are accessible at the top of each container. In colder climates, place an old blanket or a piece of burlap over the lid before you pile your straw insulation on top. This adds an extra buffer during the 2 or 3 weeks of the year when temperatures drop low enough that even 4 feet down, you might see some influence at the very top of the container near the lid. Wide shot of a backyard, north side of garage, 3 buried can lids barely visible at ground level, garden nearby. I want to address the question I get asked most often when I describe this system to people, which is, does it actually work in extreme cold? What happens in Minnesota in January when it is 20 below zero for a week straight? The answer is that the system handles it better than you might expect, but with one important nuance. The stable temperature zone, that 50 to 55 degree band, exists at around 4 feet deep. Your buried cans are only 14 to 16 inches deep at most. That means the bottom of your storage containers is sitting in the stable zone, but the top few inches, near the lid, is more influenced by surface conditions than the deep earth is. In a severe cold snap, that top layer can approach freezing, which is actually fine for most root vegetables because they are naturally designed to handle temperatures just above freezing. But if you are in a climate that regularly sees sustained temperatures below -10 Fahrenheit, you should add extra insulation on top of your buried containers during winter. A bale of straw laid over each lid, or a styrofoam cooler lid placed on top before the straw goes on, is enough to maintain the interior temperature in the safe range even in very hard winters. Farmers in Minnesota and Wisconsin have been using this technique with exactly that modification for well over a century. In hot climates, the system works differently. In Texas or Arizona, the surface soil temperature is warmer and the stable zone is deeper, sitting closer to 5 or 6 feet in some parts of the deep south. For those climates, digging a little deeper than the standard 14 to 16 inches makes a meaningful difference. Even going down to 24 inches moves you into noticeably cooler soil and extends the reliable storage season significantly. An agricultural extension study conducted by Texas A&M University in 1998 found that buried storage containers at 24 inches depth in central Texas maintained interior temperatures between 58 and 65 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the summer months. That is warmer than the ideal root cellar range, but it is still cool enough to meaningfully extend the shelf life of most root vegetables compared to storage at room temperature, which in a Texas summer can run 85 to 90 degrees inside an unair-conditioned space. Here is where this becomes relevant to something beyond saving money on your electric bill. And I want to be straightforward with you about this part rather than dancing around it. The average American household keeps about 3 days of food at home. 3 days. That number comes from a 2019 survey conducted by the USDA's Economic Research Service, and it reflects decades of a food supply chain built around just-in-time delivery and the assumption that grocery stores will always be stocked and accessible. For most of the years most of us have been alive, that assumption has been essentially correct. The stores get restocked overnight, the supply chains run smoothly, and nobody needs to think about what happens if they do not. But the last several years have shown us some things about that assumption. Empty shelves during the early weeks of 2020, rolling power outages in Texas in February of 2021 that left people without electricity for days in temperatures that dropped to single digits. Supply chain disruptions that kept specific items unavailable for weeks or months at a time. None of those events were catastrophic collapses, but every one of them showed how thin the margin is and how quickly the situation in your own kitchen can change. An underground cold storage system does not require the grid to be working. It does not require a delivery truck to show up. It does not require you to do anything except open a lid. A serious setup with 2 or 3 buried containers and a productive garden or access to a farmer's market at harvest time can give your family 2 to 3 months of stored vegetables. That is not survivalism. That is just prudent housekeeping, the kind of thing every generation before ours considered completely normal. Hands pulling firm, intact carrots from a bucket of damp sand, clearly months after storage. I want to give you the complete list of what stores well in this system and what does not, because not everything benefits equally. Carrots stored in damp sand at 50 degrees will last 4 to 5 months with almost no quality loss. Beets last 4 to 5 months, same conditions. Turnips and parsnips are similar. Potatoes stored in dry straw at 40 to 50 degrees and in darkness, and the darkness matters because light triggers sprouting, will last 3 to 5 months depending on the variety. Russets keep longer than Yukon Golds. Fingerlings are shorter-term storage, 2 to 3 months at best. Celeriac, which is celery root, stores beautifully for 3 to 4 months and is one of the most underrated vegetables you can grow or buy at a farmer's market specifically for winter storage. Winter squash, including butternut, acorn, and Hubbard, does not need to be buried because its thick skin provides its own insulation, but storing it in a cool, dark location, ideally around 50 to 55 degrees, extends its shelf life from 2 to 4 months depending on the variety. Apples store for 2 to 4 months depending on variety. Northern Spy, Cortland, and Granny Smith are the best keepers. Fuji and Honeycrisp are shorter term. Pears store for 2 to 3 months. Again, always isolated from everything else because of the ethylene. What does not store well underground? Anything with high water content and thin skin. Tomatoes go soft quickly. Cucumbers deteriorate fast. Leafy greens do not store at all in this system. Onions and garlic actually need lower humidity than the buried container provides, and they do better in a cool, dry location above ground. For onions and garlic, A mesh bag hung in a cold garage or an unheated mudroom is more effective than underground storage. Cabbage is an interesting case. It can be stored in an underground container for 2 to 3 months, but it produces its own gases during storage that can affect other vegetables. If you store cabbage underground, give it its own dedicated container, and accept that the container will need airing out in spring before you use it for the next season's produce. I have been describing a backyard installation, but I want to briefly mention apartment and small space variations because I know not everyone has a yard to work with. If you have access to any outdoor space at all, even a narrow strip of ground along a building foundation or a community garden plot, you can use a single 5-gallon bucket at the depths we have discussed. That is enough to store 20 to 30 pounds of root vegetables through a winter. It is not a complete food storage solution, but it is meaningfully better than nothing. If you have no outdoor ground access at all, the next best option is a cool interior space. An unheated basement, a cold room, or even a north-facing closet in an older building can stay cold enough in winter to provide usable storage. The traditional method for apartment-scale root cellaring without ground access is a wooden box packed with damp sand, kept in the coolest part of your home. It is less effective than buried storage because you do not have the Earth's thermal mass working for you, but in a space that stays below 55 degrees, a sand-packed wooden box will extend the life of root vegetables significantly compared to storing them in the open or in a warm kitchen. Simple diagram showing the cross-section of a buried 5-gallon bucket, depth markings, temperature zones labeled, "Let me bring this back to where we started. You have a refrigerator that costs you money to run every single month. It will break down eventually, and it will need to be replaced. When the power goes out, it becomes useless within 4 hours." For the specific category of food it is worst at storing, root vegetables and hardy fruits, there is a method that is over 4,000 years old, costs $3 to implement, requires no electricity, never breaks, and keeps those foods in better condition for longer than the refrigerator ever could. The buried bucket root cellar is not a replacement for the refrigerator. It is the right tool for a specific job that the refrigerator was never actually designed to do well. Using both together, the electric appliance for what it does well and the earth for what it does better, is simply the most rational approach to food storage available to you. And it is an approach that your great-grandmother and every farming family before her would have considered completely obvious.